Okay, I think we are going to go ahead and get started now. Welcome again, everyone. Thank you for joining in today. I hope you can all hear me. My name is Maggie Johnson. I'm the Adaptation Program Manager for the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. In March, we came out with a report looking at the 2018 Climate Adaptation Surveys. And so today we're going to review some of those findings and also open it up for some questions later on. So let's go ahead and get started. First, a few housekeeping things. This webinar is being recorded, so keep that in mind. I will have a link for the recording that I will share afterwards if you have colleagues who would also be interested in taking a look at this webinar afterwards. The slides for this will also be available, so you can just send me a quick email if you'd like the slides afterwards as well. And just so everyone knows, this isn't exactly the right format for a webinar. This is more of a call platform, so make sure that you are muted. I'll do my best to make sure that people are muted throughout the presentation, and then we can go ahead and unmute if you have questions at the end, or you can always use the chat box as well. I think that's it for housekeeping. What I wanted to do now was do a couple quick polls just so I can get a sense of who is joining in today. So I just put out a poll. I'm asking what kind of group or agency you're representing today. So go ahead and take a look at that. That'll help me just make sure that I'm tailoring this presentation for the needs and the interests of those who are joining in. Okay, we're going to finish up, so get your last votes in. Okay, so it looks like we have mostly federal and state agencies joining with us today. A couple others from tribal, academic, and nonprofits. Great, thanks so much for helping me to see who's joining in the call today. Let's see. And we have one other poll. I'm interested to see if your work is more terrestrial and freshwater focused, or if it's more marine and coastal focused. Again, this will help me kind of tailor what we're going to talk about today. Give you a few more seconds. Okay, you should all be able to see the results of that. Looks like we have mostly people who are terrestrial or freshwater focused, about 20% who are more coastal and marine focused, and then 17% who work on everything, which is great. Okay, let's see. Thanks again for that. That just helps me figure out who's on the call and what I should be focusing most on today. So to jump right into it, the surveys have been conducted by the association since about 2011. The survey that came out in 2018 is based off of some previous surveys that we had done in 2014 and 2016. And I will make the caveat that these surveys are not, there's a lot of room for improvement. They're not a rigorous kind of social science format. So that is something that we want to consider when we're going into the 2020 surveys. But one of the purposes for modeling 2018 survey off of some of those previous ones was so that we would be able to see some of the trends that are happening over time. So again, what you're seeing is not a very scientifically rigorous assessment, but I think it still gives you a really good overview about some of the national level priorities and needs of the states. So the goal of the surveys was to understand these state needs and priorities, but to also communicate those needs and priorities within the state agencies themselves, but also to other partners. And in doing so, we could help to identify trends and potential gaps that need to be addressed when it comes to climate adaptation for fish and wildlife. The surveys went out in August, so August 1st of 2018, and they were open for about a month. The coastal and marine surveys were open a little bit longer because we didn't have quite the same amount of participation, but in the end, we got 69 submissions to what we're calling the general survey, and this survey was more focused for terrestrial and freshwater. And then we had 15 submissions for what we called the marine and coastal survey. There's a lot of reasons why we decided to do the break up the survey into two. And I can talk more about that if people are interested, but generally it's just because we wanted to get an idea of if there are different needs and priorities between these two groups. And in a lot of ways there's not, but there are a few differences, and we'll cover those later on. So why don't we go ahead and get right into it. So one of the questions we asked was, what barriers has your state encountered that may have inhibited development or implementation of adaptation? I don't think this is very surprising to see, but lack of staff time and capacity is definitely the top cited barrier to getting climate adaptation work done on the ground. And one other thing I'll mention is most all of these questions were, respondents were allowed to select multiple choices, and so that's why you're seeing the percentages so high. They don't all add up to 100%. The other thing I'll note here is in the other section, this allowed for comments from the respondents, and overwhelmingly, a lot of these comments get at issues of political will, either within the agency itself or within the state more broadly. And again, I don't think that's surprising to anybody. Another thing we looked at was how much staff time is allocated towards climate-related work. What we see is that about 30% of respondents said that they had no staff time allocated to climate-related work, which is a little disappointing. We did see that nearly 60% reported that they did have some time allocated towards climate-related work, but most of that time is devoted to learning or educating others or capacity building. So, you know, this might suggest that we're still not seeing a whole lot of implementation on the ground, that we're still kind of laying the groundwork and trying to understand climate impacts. So moving into accessing information, we wanted to get a sense of where states are getting their climate-related information from. And so the top three that were cited is peer-reviewed journals, academic institutions, and USGS. We also looked at specific federal programs because a lot of states are getting their information from federal agencies. And so the top three that came out of that was that the former LCCs, the Climate Adaptation Science Centers, and the NOAA RESAs are supplying a lot of the climate-related information to the states. One of the most important questions that we asked, in my opinion at least, was what are the high priority information needs for state agencies in the next couple of years? And so I'll just highlight the top three that came out of this was invasive species movement and range expansion. That was far and away the biggest need that was cited by respondents. The next is habitat or landscape connectivity. And the final one is adaptive capacity of species. So these are the research areas that I will be focusing on with the AFWA Climate Committee, as well as some of the other groups that I work with. And so I'll be trying to tailor a lot of the webinars, newsletters, and things that I work on to better get some of these research information needs out there. I've also been encouraging our federal partners and other partners to really focus on some of these information needs, because these at a national level are what our states really need to understand in order to implement climate adaptation strategies on the ground. So it's not enough just to generate data or information that meets these research needs. We also need to be cognizant of what are the best ways of disseminating these products and information in ways that states can easily use it and make more effective conservation actions on the ground. So what we saw was preferred mechanisms for accessing this information is webinars, which I was honestly a little surprised about. It seems like we can all spend all day, every day on a different webinar, but it seems like these do have a lot of value for our state agency folks. So webinars are a great way of getting that information out there. Other online resources and databases were also cited as really helpful. And then of course, workshops and in-person trainings got a little over 60%. So switching gears, we just covered some of the major points in the general survey, which was again more terrestrial focused. I'm not going to cover everything in the Marine and Coastal Survey because, as I said before, a lot of the responses tended to be similar, but there are a few things that I will mention that I think are worth taking note of. The first thing I wanted to draw your attention to is this chart here. So the general survey is shown in blue, and as I mentioned, most staff time has been allocated for learning and educating others. Within marine and coastal agencies, it seems like more of their time is being spent on assessing climate impacts or conducting vulnerability assessments. So this is something to note. I think there is probably one of two things going on. Excuse me. One is that perhaps marine and coastal agencies are a little bit further along in their climate adaptation implementation. The other thing that could be for this, that could explain this change is that we had a smaller pool of respondents, and so that probably biases their responses a little bit more towards those who are really engaged in climate adaptation. So take that for what it is, but I thought it was an interesting change between the two surveys. So again, we asked where marine and coastal folks are getting their climate-related information from. I don't think it comes as a surprise. NOAA is overwhelmingly where people are getting their information, as well as academic institutions. And then we had a tie for third between peer-reviewed journals and other conservation nonprofits. Again, we looked at some specific federal programs. NOAA Fisheries overwhelmingly was the federal program where states are getting their information from, but also the NOAA RESAs and the USGS Climate Adaptation Science Centers are very important sources of information as well. So as for research needs and priorities, the first two that popped out were changes in species distribution and also increases in ocean temperature. Interestingly, for third, we had a six-way tie between a variety of different focal areas. So those include water quality and quantity, sea level rise, adaptive capacity, invasive species movement and range expansion, which again was the top priority within the general survey, and then changes in productivity. I was a little surprised to see ocean acidification was not a top priority, but then again, almost all of these are over 50%. So one way or another, there's a lot of research and information needs, particularly within the marine and coastal focus areas. Once again, we asked for preferred mechanisms for accessing this information, and this is fairly similar to what we saw with the general survey, but online resources, workshops, and in-person trainings are really important, as well as webinars and professional conferences. So as I mentioned, we compared the 2018 survey with some of our past surveys. So I looked at the 2014 and the 2016. And not all of these surveys were exactly the same. So it does make comparison a little challenging, but there are some trends that we're seeing regardless. And one of those is that there's a lack of staff time and capacity. And that is the major barrier to getting more climate action happening on the ground. We're also seeing that most staff time is remaining on assessments, particularly species or habitat-based vulnerability assessments. So we might start focusing on areas where maybe we could encourage more on the ground work to move from the assessment phase into the implementation phase. Other trends we're seeing, the Climate Adaptation Science Centers, as well as the former landscape conservation cooperatives and academic institutions remain the most consistent sources of climate-related information. Now that the LCCs are gone, for the most part, it'll be interesting to see what might fill its place. So there's a little bit of a vacuum right now, I think. And the Climate Adaptation Science Centers certainly seem like they're stepping up and filling in a lot of the holes left from the LCCs. But that's something to keep in mind, especially if you're coming from an agency or an organization that is producing information and resources for the states, that there is a hole there, and we do need to fill it. So we also looked over time at the National Fish, Wildlife, and Plants Climate Adaptation Survey. So as you all know, the strategy has 7 goals laid out to implementing climate adaptation on the ground. So we looked at each of those 7 goals, and the question wasn't asked in 2016, but it was asked in 2014. So we looked at that. There's not a whole lot of change. I guess the biggest change you could argue is an increasing awareness and motivating action, which again, I don't think is too surprising given the political climate we have around climate change right now. But we are seeing a little less engagement in every category in 2018 than we are seeing in 2014. So this is something to consider, and I know I'm working with a variety of different partners right now and figuring out how the strategy can evolve or what the next steps are going to be for the strategy moving forward. So we're still talking about and advancing climate adaptation on the ground. So people have thoughts about that. I'm really eager to hear what their experiences are with the strategy, and if they have thoughts or comments on how to move that forward in the future. I'd really value hearing people's thoughts about that. So the major takeaways, for me at least, from the survey is that, well, there's 2 things to focus on. One is state agencies need assistance with accessing particular types of information. And so some of those research priorities are species range shifts, and that includes invasive species range shifts, landscape connectivity and adaptive capacity, as well as ocean temperature. The other thing that I would note as a takeaway is that it's not enough just to come up with all of this information and data products. They need to be disseminated in a way that will be most easily consumed by folks who are working on the ground and able to effectively implement some of that research. And so the best way is for states to receive that information, according to our respondents, is through webinars and online resources, local and in-person trainings, and also research synthesis papers. So that's what I've been stressing to a lot of our partners is to focus on those 2 areas. But another thing I'll just suggest is, you know, for anybody who wants it, I'm happy to share the full report and the data set with all of you. And it is helpful to break down some of the data into regional analyses. So I've been working with some folks in the Northeast, and they took a look at the research priorities from the national perspective and then drilled down into what was most important for the Northeast region. And they found some differences, and that's helping them move forward with a climate change working group, being able to identify some of those regional level priorities. So I don't go into the regional level priorities within this report, but all of the data and information is there in the appendix. So again, if you're interested in seeing the full report, I'm happy to share that. Just send me an email and I can send that over to you. But I'm going to stop there for the moment, and I'm going to see if we have any questions in our chat boxes. And if we don't have any, oops, sorry. So feel free to ask questions if you'd like. Again, we're using the chat box, and if you would like to ask me something, you can always unmute yourself as well, but I'll stop there and let people have a moment to get your questions written out or ask me.
Maggie, this is David Herring in NOAA's Climate Program Office. Thank you for the presentation. One question was, and I think you may have just answered it, could we get a copy of your slide set?
Yes, I'm happy to send the slides as well. Just send me an email. I'm gonna see if I can get a list of all the participants today, and I'll send the report and the slides. But if I'm not able to do that, then just shoot me an email tomorrow and I can send that off to you.
Terrific.
Hi Maggie, it's Olivia Ledee. I have a question.
Sure. Hi, Olivia.
Hi. So I'm curious about the not having an increase in staff dedicated to climate change in agencies. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if folks provided more rationale. I know for a long time there was the thought that dedicated support wouldn't be provided because agencies wanted to be perceived as a responsibility for all staff. And so I'm just wondering if there's been evaluation or if people shared any additional feedback on that answer.
Yeah, that's a great nuance that I don't think was captured in the questions, because you're right. A lot of agencies have taken the position where climate should be incorporated into everything, and so they don't have necessarily a climate person or a program, and so I think that was one of the limitations of that question, was that we couldn't answer that. And offhand, I don't remember seeing any comments that got to that, but it'd be interesting to take a look at that.
Hi, this is Lynn Helbrecht from Washington Fish and Wildlife.
Hi, Lynn.
Hi. Hey, great work, Maggie. Thanks for the summary. I just wanted to maybe offer, maybe go back to when you originally introduced the survey and mentioned that there's some limitations to the kind of data we're collecting, like we're not necessarily collecting the follow-up question that you'd want to ask when someone submits an answer. So I just want to caution us against maybe too broadly interpreting some of the findings. So for example, the fact that agencies are still investing in assessments, mm-hmm. I think actually is sometimes some of the most important work we can do, and we are improving our assessments and building our understanding of adaptive capacity and better able to provide good information to our field staff. And that's really an evolving piece of work, and understanding what kind of information is most useful for adapting, on the ground action. So just not to sort of, I'm hoping we're not going to sort of move towards not supporting assessments and moving towards on the ground, because I think sometimes it's really one of the most important things we can continue to evolve.
Yeah, thank you, Lynn. I think that's a really good point, and I wasn't trying to make the point that that the assessments are not important. They are, and as you said, they are continually evolving, and we're learning more and incorporating better data into those to do that work on the ground. So I think you're right. They're really important, and we should continue to fund them and work on them. I think the thought process behind the question was that we kind of looked at it as a continuum where, assessments then fed into specific projects on the ground, and then, monitoring and evaluation, which it is more of an iterative process. And so that is something we can consider in including into a survey in the future. But that is a good point, that we shouldn't make broad statements that assessments aren't important, because they're a critical piece of climate adaptation work. Any other questions or comments for me?
Again, this is David Herring. I'm curious to know if you, based on your findings, if there are specific things you're thinking to do or not do strategically in terms of communicating or engaging or sharing information with this community or with your stakeholders? How do you move this into action?
Good question. So I guess I'll mention two things. The first, and I didn't get into this in the survey today, but in the coastal and marine focus survey, every single respondent said that they needed help with communication of climate change and climate adaptation. We didn't see quite the same need within the general survey, but so for the marine and coastal folks, it would be great to put together some communication tools or strategies to help them think about how they can communicate climate adaptation work within that coastal and marine setting. But overall, I would say moving it to action, within my capacity at AFWA, there's two things that I'm working on specifically. The first is within the AFWA Climate Adaptation Committee. And so this is a committee made up of mostly state agencies. And so right now I'm working with the chairs on identifying some practical tool sets or best management practices that can be put together aimed particularly for managers. And we're using these research priorities to drive what we're going to work on and what would provide the greatest value for that. The other is I'm also working with an interagency group that's looking at national level coordination for climate adaptation. So in the past, we had the Joint Implementation Working Group, and that came out of the national strategy. Now that that group is gone, what we're trying to do is stand up a similar group that will help to coordinate and communicate these efforts on a national level. And again, I think this survey is going to help drive a lot of those conversations in tailoring what we do to be most effective on the ground. You know, I'm sure a lot of people will read this survey and have different ways of implementing it and bringing it to action. From my perspective, it's really about driving where we focus our attention on the development of tool sets and other products that can help managers on the ground. So I don't know if that answered your question completely, but I'm sure others will have other ways of implementing this in action.
It was a good answer, and I kind of had a follow-up. I don't want to bogart the microphone if others have questions, but I'll just mention I serve as program manager for the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit, and I'm very interested in maybe having a follow-up conversation with you and others, because a lot of what you just said in your answer has a lot of synergy with things that we are doing and would like to do, and in partnership. So I'd be happy to maybe have a follow-up discussion on some of those details.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds great. I'd love to do that.
Hey, Maggie, this is Bruce Stein. I wanted to just bring up, talking about coordination and action. One of the topics that was raised briefly last week related to the U.S. Forest Service and their new, what they call their shared stewardship strategy, which is about working with the states to do more forest restoration and well, timber harvest, among other things. But I learned that the state forest action plans are actually due for revisions in 2020, and there's a requirement that they have to take into account state wildlife action plans. And so I just kind of wanted to put on the, as a placeholder, that I think this may be an opportunity for the state wildlife agencies to sort of think about how they can engage there, and especially from a climate adaptation perspective, because the last thing we want is for these state forest plans to get put together and shared stewardship agreements, and not have wildlife and climate adaptation well represented in those things.
Yeah, thank you, Bruce. And I don't know if I don't want to put you on the spot, but I don't know if you wanted to say anything about your recent analysis of the Southeast and the swaps there, incorporating climate into that. I think that's really relevant to the survey findings as well.
Yeah, so as Maggie mentioned, we, as part of a USGS funded project, our so-called Vital Futures project, we looked at all 17 wildlife action plans from across the Southeast. That included Puerto Rico. And, not surprising, and from the perspective of how they incorporated or addressed climate change as part of the 2015 action plan revisions. And I guess the good news is that every single one of them did address to one degree or another climate change, but as not surprisingly, pretty variable in the way in which they did it. A lot of them, just covering some very basic stuff, some of them going into more detail, even using climate as a criterion in the selection of species of greatest conservation need, and then relatively few actually taking it all the way to, sort of using climate to help them reconsider their underlying conservation and wildlife goals, or informing on the ground action. But it seems like it's moving in the right direction, and some of the states did a really good job, and others, it was more of a not quite as deep a dive, but I think it was suggests that the states are, even in places where the politics are a little awkward, they actually are incorporating climate considerations.
Great, thank you, Bruce. We do have a question in the chat box from Amanda Meyer. She asks, do you have suggestions for increasing staff capacity for climate change work within agencies that don't have dedicated climate staff? This is something I think every agency has struggled with. And I think there's two ways of going about that. One is we need to do a better job of engaging state agency leadership to have them understand why climate adaptation is critical to the work that they're doing, and in engaging them, it will help to empower their staff to spend more time and capacity on climate. How you do that is a little bit more challenging. From where I am at AFWA, I've been trying to have more conversations with directors and other agency leadership on climate, and bringing that really to the forefront. The other thing that I'll mention is that it's all about how you frame it. And so I think one of the most important things that we can do as a community is really acknowledge and make the point that doing climate adaptation work is really, it fits in to a lot of the traditional management strategies that we're already doing. It's just making sure that it's done within a lens of climate change. And so I think that's one of the things we need to keep talking about, is that all of the work that encompasses climate adaptation is really about traditional management strategies. It's just making sure that they're climate informed. And so I think that will help people see that you don't need to, have a ton of new staff just working on this. Every staff member can incorporate climate adaptation into their work, and in many cases, it's not a lot different work than they're already doing. It's just making sure that it's climate informed.
Hi, Maggie. This is Karen Terwilliger. That was a great job, and we wanted to thank you for letting us use some of your slides at the recent Northeast Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies conference in our special climate change symposium. It was extremely helpful. We had a lot of directors in the room, but speaking to and trying to address the last question, another option for increasing capacity in staff is to work with, partner with, collaborate with the other folks that really scored high on where to get the information from. For example, in the Northeast, the AFWA states are working really closely with the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center that fed so much great information to the last round of swaps, the last revision. And they've actually sponsored and are contracting some contractors, me actually, and my team, to work with the state fish and wildlife agencies and gather the needs and then help states move through the barriers that you've helped identify in this survey into action. And we've got some really good ideas, but the Climate Adaptation Science Centers are a great partner, and they really are reaching out to state fish and wildlife agencies. And with any luck over the next year, we'll be able to really help position the next revisions for SWAP to help move and break through the barriers into actions. And just real quick, some of your slides showed that one really active role that states have in climate change is monitoring. You know, folks are out on the ground. And another thing that we learned from our symposium, some of our partners said, hey, state fish and wildlife agencies, it's critical that your voices be heard in the overall climate arena in terms of economic development and planning. So we're learning a lot about the specific roles of state fish and wildlife agencies and actions. So we'll keep you posted, but thank you so much for sharing the results of these surveys.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. And the work that you guys are doing in the Northeast is really, really great. So I'm looking forward to keeping up with that and hopefully having some results to share with at a national level of what you guys are doing would be great. But I think Karen brings up a good point that kind of feeds into another question that I'm seeing in the chat box. Is that a lot of the USGS Climate Adaptation Science Centers have struggled a little bit with figuring out how much basic climate knowledge versus some of the more applied information that they want to focus on. And I think this is hard. I know all of the Climate Adaptation Science Centers are struggling with that. And each one is kind of coming at it a little bit differently. Karen mentioned some of the efforts going on in the Northeast. I know in the North Central, they've been doing surveys. So there's a lot of different ways to come at it, but I think one of the major things is that the states within those regions need to be able to communicate better with the Climate Adaptation Science Centers. So, you know, depending on whether it's, you know, a working group that you're pulling together or a survey or maybe some listening sessions, I think there's a lot of opportunities there to have a better flow of communication so that you can balance some of those designs in training and in information. But it's not easy. But you know, this is my pitch. I'm here to help facilitate those conversations. So if you're at a climate science center that needs help in reaching out to their states, or if you're a state who needs particular information and wants help in getting in touch with these centers, you know, that's what I'm here for. So, you know, please feel free to reach out to me and I can help brainstorm what the right way of doing that for your region or your state or particular science center might be. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat box. Any other questions or comments from the audience?
Hey Maggie, it's Roger Griffiths from NOAA Fisheries. Thank you so much for the presentation. Really, really beautifully done. I'm just so glad AFWA's been doing these. An interesting trajectory. One of the reasons why we were so interested in doing the marine and coastal survey, in addition to the general one that had been going a couple of years, obviously we were interested in specific needs of our sister marine agencies in the states. As you said, that may have unique needs or capacities. And we were particularly interested in what we could do to perhaps try and help address some of these, or even learn from our state partners. So I think I flagged in the chat, but as you said, there's a variety of there's rich information in the rest of the survey. I think I recall one or two of the questions that actually asks us more specifically about what particular data or science or kinds of things tools would be useful. And that was an interesting set of results as well. I just wanted to flag that for people. And just thank you. I think it'd be really useful to maybe build on this and see how to better connect providers and users on all ends of the spectrum. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Roger. You started breaking up a little bit, but you make a good point. So the information I shared today, there's a whole lot more questions and data in the full report. And like I said, the entire survey and all the survey responses are included in the appendix. So there's a lot more to dig into. This was really a very broad overview of some of the questions and some of the information that I thought was worth highlighting. But as Roger said, there's a lot more to dig into. So again, I'm happy to share that report. I'm going to see if I can get a full list of all the attendees today, and I will share the report and share the slides with folks. But please don't hesitate to reach out if you have questions or needs that I can answer for you regarding the survey. Any other questions or comments? We have about 10 minutes left, but I'm okay ending early too. Okay, well, I want to thank you all for joining me today. I hope that the survey provides help to all of you in the work that you're doing. It was great pulling it together. It was really helpful for me to see what some of those national level priorities and needs are, and I'm going to be focusing on those over the next couple of years. But I'm also interested in hearing from people if you'd like to get involved in pulling the next survey together. I'd really like some help and some advice on making sure that we craft all of the questions so that it's going to be most helpful for the states and most helpful for those partners as well. So please reach out if you're interested in getting involved for the 2020 survey. But thank you all again. I'll send out the recording to this as well. But I really appreciate you joining in, and I look forward to working with you all soon.